Welcome at the third installment of our meetings with history at the Depot History Center. My name is Marta Kopiniak and I'm a guide at the Depot History Center, and today again I will be your guide at our journey through history. After the thaw of 1956 and Gomułka's rise to power, people experienced a reality of a so-called small stabilization. There were no immediate threats, life finally seemed to calm down, and people could finally live on their own lives. Behind me is a kiosk symbolizing this period of the people's Poland. You can see toilet paper, that was hard to get luxurious product, some cigarettes from the era, magazines, newspapers, toys and cardboard records, which were cheaply made phonograph records in the size of a postcard. This state of apparent calm lasted until 1968, the middle of the Polish People's Republic, after which the communist authorities never regained the power they had before. Student strikes of 1968 were triggered by the removal of Adam Mickiewicz's Dziady from the National Theatre in Warsaw. The play is considered a masterpiece of Polish literature, but has strong anti-Russian connotations, which were being interpreted as anti-Tsarist by the director of the National Theatre in Warsaw. That interpretation didn't appeal to the authorities, who were seeing it as anti-Soviet and unduly pro-religious, which was only proven to them by the applauses from the audience during the allegedly anti-Soviet parts. Students from Warsaw began protesting this decision, but were met with brutal repressions. Students from other cities, including Wrocław, joined them in their cause by collecting signatures under a petition to return Dziady to the theatre and occupational rallies in the universities. Students from Wrocław particularly demanded reliable information and discussion on the most important problems concerning Polish society, an end to the anti-Semitic campaign launched in reaction to the unrest, and punishment of the people responsible for the brutal actions against students in Warsaw. None of the actions brought the expected outcome. Many students were expelled from universities, many were called up to their mandatory service in the army, and many were brought to trial and sentenced. There was also the issue of the Polish involvement in the military intervention of the Warsaw Pact in Czechoslovakia to suppress the Prague Spring, an attempt at liberalization and reform of the system by the Czech authorities. Both the intervention and the students' protests had a common denominator: a violent and strong reaction to any attempt of reform. Despite the tumultuous year of 1968, the reality of small stabilization did not end overnight. Social life still flourished. People went on holiday with the Employee Holiday Fund and waited in anticipation for the next episode of More Than Life at Stake, stawka większa niż życie, all the while shunning politics. Sport in Wrocław really flourished during the communist era, partially because of the funding coming from the army and the militia, and partially because the communist authorities liked to use sport as part of their propaganda. There were many outstanding sportsmen and sportswomen in Wrocław during the communist period. One of them was swimmer Marek Petrusewicz, who is a silver medalist from the Turin European Championships in 1954, and who broke the world record for 100 meters in breaststroke here in Wrocław. And then another outstanding person is Wanda Rutkiewicz, who was the first Polish citizen to stand atop Mount Everest and the first woman to ever conquer K2. Besides Marek Petrusewicz and Wanda Rutkiewicz, there is also Ryszard Szulkowski, a four-time champion of Peace Race, an international bike race held in the Eastern Bloc. He, in total, took part in 89 stages, and in 52 of them, he was the leader. As previously mentioned, the communist propaganda used the success of Polish sports people to project a picture of greatness of the country and the whole system. Some sports people decided to endorse the system, some stayed away from politics. However, not only sports people, but also many other professionals, like actors, filmmakers, journalists, and writers, had to work with and within the system to actually carry on with their work. That's just how the system was set up, and there was no easy alternative. It seemed though that nothing was easy, even the everyday life. Supply shortages were a common occurrence with which everybody had to deal with, and reasons for those were complex and not easily overcome by the authorities. That is why, in an effort to at least ease the struggle, the year 1959 marked the introduction of meat-free Mondays, strictly adhered to in shops, restaurants, canteens, and schools. Another aspect of the constant supply shortages was the introduction of ration coupons. That in Polish People's Republic took the shape of paper sheets with small sections one would cut off with every purchase. Ration coupons allowed people to at least buy something, even if it wasn't enough. What might seem paradoxical, people actually preferred the ration coupons as means of distributing the goods. They soothed the worry of empty shelves and hungry mouths to feed. The hours-long queues and lack of virtually everything finally seemed to come to an end in the first part of the 1970s, with Edward Gierek, the new Communist Party leader, and his propaganda of success and loans taken abroad. The economy seemed to develop at a fast pace, everyday worries seemed to lessen, and Comrade Gierek seemed to be able to buy Poland out of the stagnation it was in before. However, the act dropped in the second part of the 1970s when people again stood in hours-long queues to buy anything that they could find on the shelves. It was at this time that the famous queuing lists were developed and people woke up from what seemed to be just a dream. You might remember from previous installments of Meetings with History that Wrocław is considered to be a successor of the interwar legacy of the city of Lviv. And that is thanks to many of the people whose images you see above me. Many of them were scholars working at the John Casimir University, Uniwersytet Jana Kazimierza, in Lviv. The first rector of the Joint University and Polytechnic in Wrocław, Stanisław Kulczyński, was the former rector of the Lviv University. Hugo Steinhaus, Stanisław Tołpa, Bogusława Jeżowska-Trzebiatowska, and many others moved to Wrocław to continue their pre-war studies. There weren't that many of former Lviv citizens, but they were clearly visible. Not only were they scholars, but also tram conductors, restaurant owners, and waiters. Besides the academic part of Wrocław, there is also the artistic, creative one. Wrocław was and still is to this day the host of Jazz on the Oder and Wrocławia Cantas, two vastly different but similarly popular music festivals. There were the artists behind the Wrocław School of Posters, Jan Sawka and Eugeniusz Getz-Stankiewicz. Theater icons such as Jerzy Grotowski and Henryk Tomaszewski created their most significant work here. Anna German, Maria Koterbska, Stanisław Druszcz, Marek Chłasko, Witold Pyrkosz, Wojciech Jerzy Has and Tadeusz Różewicz are all linked one way or the other with Wrocław, as is their work. Yet, no matter who you were, an artist, a scholar, a shop assistant, or an electrician, at one point in your life you faced the problem on everybody's mind: the lack of flats. All governments during the Polish People's Republic tried to lessen the issue. For example, during the Gomułka's era, the communists built affordable housing using cheap materials, which resulted in small, claustrophobic flats with blind kitchens. Edward Gierek and his government, on the other hand, pushed the idea of housing cooperatives as the main force behind creating housing space. What is important to understand when talking about the lack of flats is the fact that you could not simply buy a flat. It was given to you by the state after you have saved up enough to cover your share. And since the system was flawed, there were many instances of favoring family members, co-workers, and simply people who could somehow benefit the person in charge of the decision. In Wrocław, there was also the issue of rebuilding the city from war damage. The rubble had to be tidied up and holes in the city landscape had to be filled. The relative freedom of the first post-war years quickly changed into the unforgiving doctrine of socialist realism, in which the architects had to work. Many forgettable and dull buildings were created, but not all were like that. Take the Panorama of Wrocławice building, for example, or Wrocław's Manhattan on Grunwaldzki Square, or Trzonolinowiec, built from top to bottom. But the most unique of them all is the Igloo House, designed and built by architect Witold Lipiński as a sort of construction experiment, ecological and self-sufficient in the architect's mind. The best example of creativity and resilience in the face of the system and harsh reality. Thank you for joining us for the third episode of Meetings with History Online. If you have any thoughts or comments, please share them with us below, and I hope we will see you next month.